What was the most complicated Mercedes passenger car engine ever produced? This is a really interesting question that I get asked probably once every 6 to 8 months. And the question is this: which of the Mercedes engines was the most complicated, difficult to repair, difficult to work on, maybe even problematic to, make into a perfect running, normal running engine? And there are a couple of candidates that fit the bill really well that we could talk about all day. In other words, it could be like a 3 or 4-way tie. But we're going to go over some of the most complicated Mercedes passenger car engines, why they were so complicated, and whether or not they can actually be made to run like they are supposed to. So the first engine that I think comes to mind, or the first engine that comes to mind for most people, is the incredibly mysterious and exotic M100.980. This was the early 6.3 liter V8 that was used from 1966 onward, or 65 onward, in the 600 grosser, the big fat giant 600. And this engine is viewed as extremely complicated in the 600 for 3 reasons. Number one, it has a oil pressure driven fan clutch that was taken from the M189 engine in the 300 Adenauer. This fan clutch uses a live high pressure oil feed on the front of the engine, taken from the engine oil that goes through a thermostat when the engine reaches 100 Celsius, that pushes hot oil through the fan and allows it to couple like a torque converter. This fan clutch design was infused with the water pump, meaning that if a seal inside the water pump goes, cooling water will drain through the oil circuit of the fan clutch and get into the engine oil. And this happened to me on a 600 one time. I ended up having to replace the entire water pump with a new unit from Mercedes because it was the only thing we could get. And once we put that pump on, everything went back together really, really fast and really, really nice. So fan clutches in those cars make them real complicated. The second thing is the mechanical injection pump with 8 plungers. While this pump may seem extremely complicated to some people who look at it at first glance, it's really a pretty reliable pump. The only thing that goes bad is the governor O-ring, which can lead to some very strange behavior, such as gasoline getting into the oil-filled governor on the injection pump. Now, let's look at let's look at some of the challenges in getting an M100 to run right. First of all, you really have to deal with that fan clutch. And in the 6.3, by the way, the 300 SEL 6.3, they went to a conventional water pump and fan clutch, which makes the engine a lot less complicated. But one of the things that really hurts these engines is that they have dual point distributors, and the dual points have to be adjusted often. They can be adjusted using a feeler gauge, no matter what anybody says. I've had great success adjusting the feeler gauge, that people get hung up on the ignition problems of these things. The best way to handle an M100 engine and get it back on the road and make it work right is check every single coolant pipe for corrosion and pull all the plugs and do a coolant pressure test to make sure the heads haven't rotted away. Second of all, make sure that you adjust valves and account for the condition of the camshafts. And then number 3, make sure that you're not pumping rusty gas through it so you don't mess up that injection pump. Parts for these engines are not readily available. In some areas, like the phenolic spacers for the injectors, if you have a 6.3, you know what I'm talking about. But for the most part, items on this engine are incredibly robust and don't require billions of dollars to get an order. You just need to be very patient and teach yourself how to go through these things step by step methodically. Now, the second engine is related to this M100 in some ways, and that is the M189. The M189 engine debuted at the end of 1957. It was based on the 300 SL engine, the M198, but it has a number of variables that make it more complicated. When the engine was in the 300 at an hour, it was complicated enough because accessibility was limited and it was very hard to work on things like the AC compressor if it was so equipped. But problems later began to occur when they decided to cast the block in aluminum, which is a major hindrance if you're dealing with a corroded block. And on top of that, you have a lot of oil lines. You have an oil cooler that's integrated into the water jacket of the engine. You have, again, the hydraulic fan clutch from the M100 on some cars. And last but not least, you have this problem of the water pump and generator being serialized in the side of the engine. And I think of all the Mercedes engines, this is one of the ones that is the most complicated because it does not have anything on it that is straightforward and easy to get to. Changing a water pump is not straightforward and easy. Changing a belt is not straightforward and easy because you have a bracket on the front of the engine that has to slide freely left and right. Finding an oil leak on this engine is not straightforward and easy because there's a lot of additional oil plumbing hardware. And so for this reason, I'd say that the M189 engine definitely merits the label of being extremely complicated. In order to make an M189 engine work right, you have to know a really good machinist and you have to have a lot of money if it boils down to it, or you have to have a lot of patience and a lot of willingness to acquire new skills, and unfortunately either the ability to go long hours without sleep or a lot of time on your hands. But the result is quite rewarding, especially when you do some upgrades to things like the rear axle. And by the way, it has a dual point distributor as well. Do you see the trend here? Now, the third Mercedes engine that I find to be an unnecessarily complicated engine is the M104.990 and 991 family that was used on the 1994-95 E320. These engines are, I should say 93 to 95 300E and E320. These engines did not have good clear-cut electronic diagnostics. They have double overhead cams, so you have a complicated front timing cover to remove. When they poop a head gasket, which they inevitably do, and they need wiring harnesses, and they need a throttle actuator, replacing all the parts is one thing. Getting the computer controls for the engine to understand that they were replaced and getting the codes to go away is another thing. They're also very funny about security breaches. So if you're working on one of these engines, you have to plan for the worst and you have to have a lot of patience. So these are three of the most complex Mercedes engines I thought that I could name. There are some other candidates like the M110 engine with a carburetor that was used from 1975 and 76 in the US with a bunch of emissions controls. Pulling the head on an M110 plus dealing with a bunch of emissions controls is a major headache. You could say that the M119 KE Jetronic engine from 1990 and 91 is quite complicated. And you could also make a very profound case for the AMG Quad Cam V8, which I know what you're thinking. It's not completely a Mercedes engine, but it is completely a Mercedes engine. It just has some extra stuff added on top. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please stay tuned for more great content like this where we talk about weird, obscure Mercedes stuff. And I hope you guys enjoy your holiday season. I will be here trying to do things to improve my shop. And if you guys happen to be in Florida visiting family for the holidays, call me and stop by, and you're welcome to come in and visit me for a little bit. Thank you guys, and I'll see you in the future.